All right, so this is how we want to the last talk of the day, and it's sort of intentionally the way we set it up, having Pedro come in and talk to us, because he was one of the first talk when we did DevFest last year. His talk at that time was really inspirational to our students. He's very memorable. People still talk about it, remember what he said and his experience, how he kind of grew into kind of a big developer and a big corporation right now. And sort of he shared his story at that time. But today it's mostly the technical side. Going very technical, right?
Semi-technical.
He's really geeking out with Angular for a while. He's been like teaching their senior developers Angular, so he's been doing that, a lot of experience with Angular. So if you're interested in Angular, he's the guy to talk to. But without further ado, Pedro, he was one of my sources. I'm biased when I mention his name because everything is great. But here it is, Pedro.
Thank you. I appreciate the handoff. And before I start, I got to shout out Hendrix. So he taught me Angular, right? Like 3-4 years ago. I wrote my first Angular thanks to Hendrix. So I kind of just continued along that path. And Eva, now she's here, they both taught me Angular. So, I'm going to have a short talk on it, but I gotta give them a huge shout out. I don't even think I'd be standing here had it not been for them too. And I'm always gonna shout them out. So round of applause. Especially for setting all this up. I don't know how you guys do it, but I appreciate it. And I'm sure everybody else here appreciates it too. All right. So quick intro, my name is Pedro Ravel. I am a software engineer, full stack developer. I also am an adjunct professor here at Lehman College. And this talk in particular, we had a good talk on Angular components already, so I feel like that was a good leeway into my talk. I'll give you some backstory on this. So at work, I was really pushing for D3, which is the first thing I wanted to talk about now, right? Our application was full of data, just tons of data, and I was like, we need to visualize this. So I started pitching to everybody, you know what? We need to visualize this stuff to help our customers interact with our application better. And they bought it for whatever reason, right? So, they said, you know what, if you can do it, then we'll work with you to put this into production. I was like, all right, cool. So I started playing around with it, but our application from the front end side was built in Angular, right? So I didn't realize at the time that there was going to be a challenge having Angular communicate with D3 because they both have their own separate life cycles that you have to be concerned about, right? They both update, they both render. So getting them to talk was an interesting experience for me. I had to learn that on my own. There's not a ton of documentation out in Google for it. You can't search for it that simply because they're both their own separate entities, right? So D3 is a charting library. I'm going to get into that in a bit. And then Angular is a front-end framework. So getting them to work in harmony was something that I felt like is interesting enough to share with you guys, and hopefully you guys can take away something from this. So I'm not great with slides, so I'm not going to read all this stuff to you guys. But D3, right? D3, data-driven documents. This is from the website, right? D3 is a JavaScript library for manipulating documents based on data. You give it data, and it'll render something for you. Now, you have to write the code yourself from scratch to what you want to render. So I don't know if any of you guys have ever used any other charting tools. D3, you have to write. There's a huge learning curve because you have to literally write line by line how you want your chart to be rendered. It has a lot of power to it. You can basically build anything, but there's a little learning curve to it. So just going on from what I got from d3.org, D3 helps you bring data to life using HTML, SVG, and CSS. D3's emphasis on web standards gives you the full capabilities of modern browsers without trying yourself to a proprietary framework. Open source. You guys can, if you guys can think it, you can build it with D3, and I'm all for flexibility, right? So moving on, this is something that I also pulled from their website. I implore you guys to take a look at it. If you notice up here, I'm sorry, a little small, but if you just capture what's on where it says var svg equals I also pulled this from the website. D3.select body, so it'll grab the body element, right, from your HTML, and then you can append the SVG element to it. And from there, you start actually adding the width, the height, and the lines, and everything like that. So that's cool, because everything's written in code. You don't have to play around with the HTML too much. And then this is what the data looks like that's rendering this little nice circular looking thing over here. I mean, I don't know what it's used for, but that looks hot. Like, I like the way that looks. So D3, like I mentioned earlier, has a life cycle to it, right? It has the enter, the exit, and the update. What enter means is when data is entered, right? When the data is processed on the D3 side, you start to build out the all the SVG elements that are gonna render your graph. So here we have select all circle. The top, right? Create basic circles. This is, you see that where it says data and then it says enter? It's gonna pull the data, and then when it enters into its life cycle, it's going to render whatever you have after that. So I'm appending circles. I'm adding a CX attribute where it's going to be placed on the HTML canvas. I'm adding the CY, the Y value, and I'm adding the radius, right? It's going to do all that on the fly. So that's one. Then here we rejoin data. There could be an update, right? What if your data changes in your application? So we're going to update the data. We reset the data, right? Right here, .data eval. This is just fancy for new data coming in. And then exit will remove data sets that are from that whatever data source you're pulling from, right? It could be an array of numbers. It could be an array of objects. Whatever it is, D3 gives you the ability to take that data, render it the way you want to. If that data changes and stuff is removed, you can elegantly remove it from your SVG element. Same thing with updating. Well, for updating, you don't have to do enter or exit. If you just grab the circle element again, and do all this fancy stuff, which we'll get to in a bit, it'll automatically update. What can update, right? Well, what if yesterday you wanna talk about how well you did perform you're performing now when you're selling ice cream bars, whatever, right? And 10 minutes ago you sold 50 ice cream bars, and today it shows 50 ice cream bars in a bar chart. Well, what if you sold 20 more, right? It's at 70, so you can actually have your SVG element pull from that data and say, okay, well, now I want to render 70 as a bar chart, right? We'll get to that in a bit. So that's pretty cool. I'm going to switch over to Angular now. So Angular 2 adopts TypeScript, Angular 2 Plus. So you could use JavaScript, but TypeScript is the preferred language going forward. Quick intro here, TypeScript is a superset of JavaScript, which primarily provides optional static typing, classes, interfaces. One of the benefits is to enable IDEs to provide a richer environment for spotting common errors as you type the code. TypeScript transpiles to JavaScript. So when you're building your project, you write your TypeScript, but the browser understands JavaScript, right? So when you're building it, there's like a compiler that will transpile your TypeScript, turn it into JavaScript, and then that's something that the browser can understand. That's all done for you with Angular CLI. If you build from Angular, Angular handles all that for you. So that's actually really interesting. Examples, real quick. So I have person name, right? I'm setting it to a string, right? And I try to make person name an empty object. It's complaining, right? You don't see that in JavaScript. TypeScript gives you that ability to see your errors beforehand so you don't make any mistakes in code, right? Here we have an interface, person, right? So my interface, I give it a name, I give it a last name, I give it a function. Any data, right, that I'm going to map to something with interface person that implements that interface better have a first name, a last name, and a function called say hi, right? You can see my Goku right there. Everything's fine. Nothing's complaining. Here, I omitted first name. It's complaining because this customer implements person, right? I'm sure you guys have seen that if you guys taken some sort of Java course. Same structure here, right? So this is really important because it defines your code before you start playing around with it, right? It lets you tell you ahead of time if something's wrong with your code. And that's super because when you're building big projects, you're going to mess up, right? So TypeScript is good at telling you where you messed up, at least if it's from a interface or from a type perspective. Okay? Now, I'm going to do another transition. I'm going to quickly talk about RxJS. There's a reason for all this switching, okay? RxJS, subjects and observables. So there are different ways that you can manage your data in Angular, right? Things update. Data will update on the fly. How does Angular handle all that stuff? Angular has a very clever built-in tool where it'll check for updates with your code, your variables, and it'll update them on the fly. So if something changes in your component, we'll get to that later, your view will change and capture those updates. RxJS builds upon that and makes things reactive. I'm not going to read all this stuff. If you guys want to take a look at it, I'm going to kind of give a brief intro about it. So RxJS provides us with observables. What an observable is, I tell you, all right, I make an observable and I want to subscribe to this observable. What I do with that observable is when the data changes, right, I'm going to emit an event through my observable, right? And then whoever subscribes to that observable can capture that new data. So in fact, your application will react to data updates. It'll react. That's usually a better term. I don't know if you guys have heard that before. You're reacting to data updates. You're emitting an event with the data set that's new, and anything that's subscribed to it will capture that update. So I can have 40 components. 20 of them can be observing an update, right? They can subscribe to an update. I'll show you what that guy means in code. I can subscribe to the update, right? So when I emit that update, the 20 components capture that update. It makes your code look a lot better. The way you handle these event changes is the way to go going forward. So I'm a huge proponent for RxJS if you're dealing with like huge Angular applications. That being said, let's now talk a little bit about Angular. We had a good talk about Angular a little earlier, so I think this was a good leeway. Angular is a front-end framework that makes building web applications easier and more manageable. It allows the ability to componentize, modularize, and can help provide a single-page application, among other things. So if you see this little side on the left, I got this all from Angular too, if you guys want to take a look at it. If you see this on the left right here, we have a component, we have a template, right? The way the component and the template speak to each other, two ways, event binding and property binding. We'll get into that. This injector right here is just extra functionality, extra business logic that your component can pull from, right? So if you have extra functionality, you don't want your component to worry about that too much, you make a service, and then you have your component pull the functionality from that service. So you can define all your business logic in a service. Business logic is just functions. So here we have the component will interact. Template is just HTML, and your template can interact with your component. And this is the way a component structure would look like, right? We have the root template with children. So it has two child templates, right? But then this child has a child, right? And then this child is a grandchild to the root. Does that make sense, more or less? Pretty straightforward. And Angular makes it really easy to be able to work with these things. This is a bigger explanation of that. So A can be a header, B can be another header, C and D could just be things that I want to populate on my page, and then this big box is the root, right? So we have A right here is the child of root. We have B is a child of D, but D is a child of root, right? You guys see how that flow works? Same thing here. D is only one child, the child of root. D has no children. This is the way Angular works. We build components, and this component can be reused, right? If you notice, D is reused twice, right? Reusable component. That's one of the big pushes that Angular, one of the big things that Angular provides us. Right? Bindings in Angular. How does data work? Real quick. How does data flow work? Okay. So we have regular data binding. You see those curly braces up there, which says value? That is on the template side, right? You see how a component to DOM. DOM, think of that as what the HTML is. That value will be in your component. You can map that value to your DOM, to the HTML, and it'll populate. So if a value equals my name, it's in the component. Value is a variable in component. The HTML, you put those curly braces value, you're going to see my name in the HTML, the view. Property binding, right? This is, again, from the component to the DOM. The way I like to think about property binding is, let's say if you have, if you have the source tag, right? You want to put like a picture there or like a link or whatever. You can have the value of that link in the component. And then all you have to do is write this. The value will be the actual link. This will be property, it'll be src, and then it'll render it to the DOM, right? Here, event handling. This is transitioning from the DOM to the component, okay? Events, click events. You just have to put these open and close parentheses. The handler would be event handler, right? So that's going to be in your component. So if you have a function that you want to be invoked with a click, simply put the event that you want it to occur with, put it in parentheses, and then give the function name here, and you're all set. And then this is two-way. This is if you want the view to be able to communicate with the component and the component to be able to communicate with the view. That can have its uses too. Okay. Alrighty. Lifecycle hooks. I think this will be the last one before I show you guys a quick demo. So Angular has several lifecycle hooks, right? Throughout a component's life, it goes through steps, right? It's initialized, right? You can capture the initialization of a component with ng on init. So if I implement ng on init, and then I create the function in my component, whatever I write in that function will run as soon as the component is initialized, okay? So that's very important to know. There's a few others, but I only want to talk about these two. Another one is called ng on changes, right? When I have data within a component, other components can listen to see if that data was updated at some point in code. So if one component is here and another component's over here, they're not children of anything or each other. This component can change its data. It can update its data. If this component here implements this function, right? If it imports this function, it can capture those changes and it can act accordingly if it needs to, right? At some point it may need to, and I'm going to show you a case where it's useful for me. Okay? All right, I think that's it. So let's see if I can get this up and running for you guys. I'm going to come back to these slides in a bit, but I want to show you guys something that I thought was pretty cool. All right, this is an Angular app. Styling is a little bit off because of the resolution. This is an Angular app, and this is a D3 graph. Okay? I built this graph. This is my Angular app. Keep in mind that there is a root component, and then I have a child, which is the graph. That's going to make sense. That's going to be important in a bit. So I'm going to go ahead, and I'm going to press this button right here. Update data, right? So I'm going to press this button. The graph will update. All this is doing is randomizing data that I've been given, and then I'm re-rendering the graph. But I'm updating the graph, right? So that we get that smooth transition. That's a D3 thing, and then but the button is on the Angular side, right? So that's important to keep in mind because the button doesn't care what you're setting it to. D3 doesn't care about Angular, but you can make them work together if you understand the hooks, the life cycle of Angular and the life cycle of D3. So I can continue pricing this. We're always gonna get updates. I can also, again, I don't have any exit life cycles, but I have an enter. Another enter, right? So I can continue to add extra data, and also the graph will update as well. Again, I'm going to show you guys in code how this works, but I think this is cool, right? Because, you know, D3 is not built for Angular, and Angular isn't built for D3. But if you know how they communicate together, you can write these sorts of things, and you can make your application do what you need it to do. So I'm going to go back to the slides and explain this real quick. Okay. So right here, that was the dashboard, right? I had the little tab called dashboard. So what's happening here? I had to take snippets because if we went to VS Code and I started going through those tabs, you guys would not be happy with me. So this is the logic that is in, remember I said there was a root component that was housing the graph? This is the root component's logic, right? So right here, like I said, we have a lifecycle hook, ng on init. So when the root component initializes, I make an API call, right? I have a service, a Spring Boot service in the back that's feeding me this data that you guys are seeing. I make an API call, right? I set the data set equal to the response that I get back from the API call. Once I get that data set, I pass data set, right, as a value into, remember I mentioned property binding? So property binding. I'm setting the data set equal to the data from app dashboard. We'll get to what app dashboard is in a minute. And then these are the button functionalities, right? All I'm doing is, this is just to add extra data to my data set, and this is to randomize it. So that's how you guys get to see all that finicking thing I do when I press the buttons. Okay, these are my clicks, this is my event binding here, right? So my click, add data. What's that data doing? It's just adding extra data to the already existing data set. App dashboard, we're gonna get to that in a bit, right? Keep in mind this variable named data. Keep in mind for the next slide. So I go to my next slide, and I have input data, right? So that component is accepting an input that's called data. So when I pass the data set, this component now receives that data, and I can work with it. So what do? I don't do anything except wait for that data to update. Remember I said that the previous component, the root component, gets the data from a call to one of my APIs, right? Well, that API doesn't come to me in a second, right? It takes a little bit for it to come. So what I'm doing here is I'm waiting to see if that data in that component changes. When that data set changes, I'm acting upon it, okay? This has pros and cons. Changes will give you the changes of everything in your Angular app. But you can be explicit and look for specific things. So changes is the object that ng-on-changes gives us that manages the data set in your Angular app. So what do I do here? I'm checking if it's the first change, right? If it's not the first change, because if it's the first change, I don't care about it. I want it when it's not the first change, because the second change is with the API called return the data to me, okay? Then I check if the changes also give us value to the previous value. Well, if the previous value was empty, I'm sorry, if the current value has an actual object or something from the API call, that means the previous value was empty because I didn't have anything before it. So I have to make sure that I'm checking if it's not the first change, if there is no previous value, meaning if this is the first actual value I get, I simply render the line graph. This is render line graph is a service that I wrote. I can show you guys that later if you want to see it. I render the line graph. Another cool thing about D3 is I didn't mention this. This is a class name. So in my HTML, I literally only have a div and this class name. And then D3 does that whole thing with that line that you saw. It automatically populates the div with the SVG and the lines and the circles in code. So that's pretty cool. So if I'm not the first change and I don't have a previous value, then do this. But if past that, if I do have a previous value, that must mean that the data at some point updated, right? So if I updated, I update the graph instead. I call the update function. Again, that's another function that I wrote for D3. So that's how you see this, right? I'm gonna refresh the page to since you guys do this, I'm gonna refresh, right? Boom, I make the API call. This is the data set I'm getting from my service, okay? Now I press this button, update, okay? That means I'm already looking at the update method that had an ng-on-changes. I press this button. Well, the data changed again. First, the data changed when I pressed this button, but now the data changed when I pressed this. So I'm constantly calling, I'm constantly calling this else case right here, which is the update function. And that update function is handling whether I'm updating the data or I'm adding new data to the data set. So that's that one. Let's go to the next one. I have another example. And this time we use RxJS. So I'm going to go through how we did that here, right? Here I have 4 components. I don't know why it looks like that, but it shouldn't be. It shouldn't be too problematic. Here I have 4 components. Each component represents this graph and this data. So I'm going to press the button and I'm going to see what happens. I don't know why it looks like that. It's not looking like that on my screen. Okay. I'm going to press this button, right? We're going to see the graphs are going to change, the bars, and then these things right here are going to populate. So if it's a 404, it's red. If it's a 200, it's blue. I have that written in my HTML code. But I'm not doing anything to the HTML. I just have logic checking for what the status code is. The updates is managing that. So that's Angular handles that, right? But the graph, I handle that. The graph changing. And I can do it to all of them. They're all going to do their own thing. They're all going to do the whole thing. See how D3 is cool? It changes the scalings too on the sides for which was the max value and which is the min value. Okay? And that's over here. So let's look at this. Again, root and sub-child components. So this is the root. Again, ng-on init. Get the data for me, right? Pass it in as an input. Here's the subject from RxJS, right? This is the observable stuff I was talking about. I have a subject for every component because they each have their own set of data, right? All I'm doing here with this button click is I'm updating graph 4, right? I have a update function for each graph, but they all look the same, so I'm only showing this one. What am I doing when you click the button? I'm randomizing the data, and then I'm emitting it through this .next thing, right? All you have to do is bar graph data 1, don't mind my names, I'm horrible at writing variable names. Bar graph data 1 .next, and I'm passing it in the new data that I want my other subscribers to listen to. Does that make sense? So I pass in the new data by .nexting it. Then everything that's subscribed to bar graph data 1 is able to capture that updated data. Okay, and we're gonna see that once I make this bigger, right here. Okay, again, on init, I have to check which week I'm in. The week, this is also ng on init. There's week 4, week 3, week 2, week 1. The reason why I have to check, and this is a caveat to some subjects, is if one component, even though it's reused, is subscribed to a subject, if I reuse that component, every component will be updated, even though you just want to update one in particular, because they're all listening. So they're going to get every change. So what I'm doing is I'm just checking which component am I. Am I the one that's week 4, week 3, week 2, week 1, right? And then I run my subscribe. Here's the subscription. I'm subscribing to bar graph data 1, right? And then I'm giving it data object. This is the new data that was passed in when I .nexted it in the root component. Update, again, this is my bar graph. My bar graph is being updated. So this function is handling the update, and I'm passing it the new data set. And then randomize logs. This is what you see when you when the things change from 404 to 200 and the color's changing. This is Angular handles this. That's one of the cool things about Angular. You update the data on the component, and the view will react to that update. So that's pretty neat. So this is not D3 related, but this is. This is another way to get Angular working with D3, you know? Because one of the things that an issue is, Angular works tremendously well with variables that you have in place. You update a variable, the view's gonna capture it, right? D3 doesn't care about variables. It can care less about what your variables are doing. What it cares about is events. So I can capture when data changes and then cause an event to happen on D3 side, and then all this magic happens. Again, if on another note, if your data is static, if you're not too concerned about updates or like exiting or entering, if it's just one API call that happens at a given point where you get some data, you want to visualize something, D3 handles that well too, right? So in this chart, right, this is a custom chart that I made. This is just a chart. I pass it some data. Everything here is specific to, why does it look like that? Everything here, there's a bunch more stuff on that side. Everything here is specific to D3, right? So this doesn't care about Angular because the data's static, right? It's not gonna change. So I can just populate my, my graph and I'm set. But you see these little things right here, these, since I know this, I don't even have to make buttons that interact with this graph. I can write all the logic in D3. So these are just rectangles with little squares in them. I'm sorry, these are squares with squares inside them, denoting that they've been chosen or unchosen. So if I click one of these, I can update. All these updates are happening from the D3 side of things, right? And I love D3. I love seeing it. I don't understand half the time what I'm doing, but I love seeing it at least, you know? So, you know, I have like these transitions where you can remove the lines to get a better grasp of something. I mean, I changed this, but legit, this is something that I had worked on for somebody. So, but I changed it obviously for the purpose of this talk, but you can see how powerful these things are if you know how to use them. You know, I can put them back, and there's like a fancy animation that happens with them. When I make the bars come back, you know, and it rescales itself. So that blue one was the longest one, it'll rescale. The red one looks like it's the longest one. I click it off and it'll rescale. I can also enter and exit within the D3 code, not concerning myself with Angular. I have a button here that brings in new data sets. And then I can keep clicking these and it'll keep bringing them back in, the whole set. I can click this one to come back off, to disappear, do its thing. And this is all written in code. I didn't get any help with this. So, you know, again, I can show you the code in a bit if you guys want to see it, but it has a huge learning curve, but the power of the things that you can do with it is that if your mind can think of something and you work well with D3, you can build anything you want. So I'd implore you guys, you know, if you guys are learning or working Angular at work, I'd implore you guys to really take a deep dive look at, you know, Angular and all the stuff you can do with it. Super powerful tool to use, especially if you understand how all the events are emitted and all that stuff. Really cool tool. Yeah, I mean, anybody have any questions? Yes.
I think I've heard that React is another JavaScript framework that's popular. So I was wondering between Angular and React, which one do you think is the most popular?
Tough question. Tough question. They both have their pros and cons, right? So I work with both. So they both have their pros and cons. I feel like Angular comes with a lot out of the box. And, you know, RxJS was in the Angular. It's a dependency already in Angular. With React, it's a lot lighter. So if you want to do things, you have to like reach out, right? You have to reach out to other packages and kind of manage every package together. I feel like Angular does a really good job of kind of like giving you the framework you need, and you can just run with it. Like if you want maybe something like an underscore or something, you could pull that in, but technically Angular gives you everything you need. So I'd have to +1 Angular on that one. You know what I mean? Anything else? Yes.
How long did it take you to figure out how to get D3 to communicate in Angular?
Man, it took me a while. It wasn't that I didn't know the hooks. It's just that D3 gets really, really cranky if you're not handling the data well, if it's not getting these updates the correct way. It gets really cranky. So I would get to see some update in the D3 side of things, but it would still look like not what I expected because I wasn't being really explicit on the changes that I wanted to be made on the D3 side. But once I got it, like once it clicked, I ran with it. I didn't have a problem with it after that. Any other questions? All right, cool. That's all I got for you guys today. Hope you liked it.
So what we have next is we've been running a hackathon on actions on Google upstairs.